So, having discussed all of that, let's just click step over and see what happens when the HTML does indeed get sent back to the user. So let's take a look at the HTML and take some of that theory and put it into some practice. View source. I'm going to maximize this window. Okay, so most of this page is fairly straightforward. There are one or two startling exceptions to that rule. Obviously, the first item we need to look at is the hidden field here. This input field is a hidden field, and this is the view state field. This is the serialized state of the ASP.NET web controls as they have currently been sent back from ASP.NET to the client. So this acts, if you like, as a memory of what ASP.NET thinks is the state of the web page that it sent back to us. So that's one input control. And then there's another input control here, which is the name text box. We have another control which specifies the list of items that the user can select from. So that's the third input control, if you like. And then we have two buttons here, which represent this year or last year events. Depending on which button we click, either this input field or that input field will be posted back to our ASP.NET application. So we can think of these two as being a single piece of information, effectively. And then finally, at the bottom, we have another hidden input field, which is clearly associated with event validation. Now, we're not going to talk about validation here, but we are going to talk about it in the next lesson. So we ignore this event mechanism for validation at this stage. Okay, so let's close the view source and actually enter some data on this web page. So we'll enter a name, Joseph, and let's say Joseph has visited Germany and France, and then we click this button. Now, when we click this button, it's going to post data back to our web server. In fact, it's going to post 5 pieces of data, as we've just looked at. And I'm going to prove that point in a moment. So let's click the button. Okay, and that takes us back to our web page. And at this stage, the process is a little more complicated, and I'm going to explain exactly how the page is reinitialized and how the view state comes into play at this stage. Okay, so let's just consider again what happens. First of all, as before, ASP.NET creates an instance of the default class. This is our page class. So it creates an instance of that class, and that instance will contain child controls representing each of the run at server items we have on our web page. And it performs default initialization based on the contents of our markup. Okay, so that was all very well for the label, but obviously for the text box, that's only part of the story, because the text box initially was empty, and yet we know the user has just posted some data back to us. And likewise, for the list box was empty, but we've subsequently added items to it via the previous page load method on the first incarnation of the web page. So there's clearly more initialization required over and above the basic initialization that we have in the static markup. So let's go back to the code. Okay, so ASP.NET has created a page object and its controls. It's initialized the controls according to the static properties in the ASPX file. Remember, these are the original values as per the first request. So that's, if you like, the first stage of initialization. The second stage of initialization, because this is a postback, ASP.NET deserializes the view state and updates the controls. This returns the page to the state it was in before it was sent to the client last time. So, for example, it will contain the country lists. The third stage of initialization is for ASP.NET to adjust the page even further according to the posted back form data. So, for example, the text that the user has entered into the name text box and items that we've selected, all of these items of data that have been posted back have to be reflected in our controls. So by the time we get into the page load method, all of these 3 initialization steps have already happened. And again, to prove that point, let's right-click and quick watch. And let's have a look at the state of various items in the quick watch window. So we'll first start off with name text box. Click reevaluate. Okay, and the important property is the text property, and you can see that is the text that we entered. It's Joseph. Joseph is my nephew, as it happens. We could also have a look at the country list. So let's do a quick watch. And in the expression field, I'll type in country list. Dot, And you can see we even have IntelliSense here, which is quite cool. Items. And let's click reevaluate. And it shows that there are 4 items in the country list collection. And just to prove that, let's have a look at the first item. Reevaluate. And it shows the first item is Australia. So what this goes to prove is that all of the initialization has been laid in by the time we enter the page load method. The default initialization as per the ASPX page, the previous state of the object as per previous runs of the page load and event handlers, and as represented by viewState, plus any changes that the user has made on the last run through the web application at the browser, such as entering new text names. So in the page load method, if we just step over the various statements in here, okay, the next step is that ASP.NET calls the event handlers. And as we've seen, the event handler for our button adds some text to the result label. So we'll just step through the code here quite quickly. Okay, and that's the end of the event handlers. Now, the state of each control has been updated at the server, and in order to make sure that gets passed back to the client, the state of each control is now stored in viewState. So, for example, the new text in the result label is passed back as viewState. Then ASP.NET asks each control to render itself as HTML, and then finally ASP.NET releases the page object from memory, and everything gets passed back to the client. So just click step over one more time, and we can see the information that's passed back to the user.